The very first time I stepped foot in a synagogue in Oklahoma was many years before I'd ever heard of Congregation B'nai Emunah and the beauty of our community here in Tulsa. I had just completed 6 weeks of working in the North Georgia mountains at my childhood summer camp, and it was time for me to head west to begin my rabbinic training. I chose the seminary where everyone goes to become a star, Los Angeles. Being in my early 20s and at the beginning of a big life transition, I was eager to see this journey as full of meaning and purpose. And so I did everything I could to leave the page blank and open myself up to the stories of the road. I was a Jack Kerouac wannabe, and the first up on my playlist was Tom Petty's Into the Great Wide Open. There were a few routes open to me that summer that could have gotten me from North Georgia to Los Angeles, but I guess knowing that I-40 overlapped with Route 66, I was drawn to that path and to that adventure and discovery. My first days of the trip brought me through Tennessee and into Arkansas. First Nashville to see the sights, then I spent a night in Memphis with my feet 10 feet off of Beale. Pretty quickly, I realized Little Rock was not really much for me to discover. And next up was Oklahoma. As I checked the calendar on those late July nights, I realized the next evening began the Jewish holiday of Tisha B'Av, the saddest day of the Jewish year, and that it would be interesting to see if anything was happening in a place where I could stop. I was going to become a rabbi after all. Wouldn't it make sense to get a sense of how Jews in the middle of the country lived their lives? I connected to Wi-Fi on my laptop and started to do some research. Emmanuel Synagogue in Oklahoma City was not too far off my route, and there was at least a chance they would be holding services. The next morning before heading out, I called the synagogue office. I introduced myself and asked if Tisha B'Av services would be taking place. Whoever answered that phone was taken a bit aback. I could hear it in their voice. Had I called about Rosh Hashanah, now that would have made sense. Calling about Tisha B'Av? Who does that? In what felt like a reluctant tone, the person on the other end of the line told me the start time and quickly hung up. Being up for an adventure, that's what I was there for. I figured it was worth the risk. The day's drive was uneventful, and I remember arriving in the parking lot an hour and a half before the service was slated to begin. I was tired of being behind the wheel, so I decided to lean my chair back, close my eyes, and take a nap. Maybe 45 minutes later, or an hour, I got a tap on my window. It was the lay leader scheduled to conduct services for that evening. I think Emmanuel Synagogue perhaps was between rabbis at the time, or the clergy was on vacation. One of you could probably tell me those facts better than I could recall. But whatever the situation, the lay leader was excited to learn I was on my way to rabbinical school and quickly asked if I knew the services and rituals associated with the holiday. And then he turned to me and said, "You know no one comes to Tisha B'Av, right?" Of course I was aware. Before I knew it, I was in front of a room of maybe 12 people, chanting the Book of Lamentations and leading them through the customs of the moment. I guess I was a rabbi in Oklahoma long before I knew it. Someone offered to put me up for the night, and the next morning I was back on the road. But two things stick out to me from that first Oklahoma experience. First, the people of Oklahoma are nice, like really nice, like genuinely nice, and it's a nice that they mean, and it comes through, and I felt it even in those brief moments that I got to experience the Jewish community of this state for the very first time. But secondly, and important for what I want to speak about today, is that very few people observe Tisha B'Av. Yes, it's done out of obligation in some communities, and yes, a small percentage of people care enough about the holiday to stop at a synagogue while on their road trip. But if you were to survey the Jewish world in 2022, it's a holiday we don't think much about. It's not a moment of communal connection and cohesion. And I actually think that makes a lot of sense. Tisha B'Av, as I said, is the saddest day on the Jewish calendar. It's the date we observe the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. Like on Yom Kippur, we fast for 25 hours. And throughout Jewish history, we've used this date as a sort of catch-all for commemorating many of the painful and difficult tragedies that have befallen the Jewish people. The story of Tisha B'Av is a narrative of doom and gloom. But who wants to go out of their way to remind themselves of all the bad things that have happened to our people? What fun is that? What I want to say this morning, though, is that Tisha B'Av is one of the most significant holidays on our calendar. And its observance says something essential about Judaism and the strength of our tradition. What Tisha B'Av, and more broadly, the Jewish response to the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, demonstrates is an example of how our people have responded to catastrophe. We know what to do when the world is turned upside down. Our people has a particular genius for reacting to crisis and wholesale change. And this is something I think we as Jews can bring not only to our own community and connect with, but can share with the whole world. Of course, our depth of experience in this arena is not a coincidence. Throughout Jewish history, we have had to adapt and overcome. There have been enemies of our people who have plundered and pillaged. The odds stacked against us have seemed insurmountable. And yet, we are still here. We have survived despite our challenges. We have a talent for responding to these consequential moments. And we need, in this moment, to better recognize what those skills are of our ancestors and those who came before us, so perhaps we can emulate them in this moment. I want to talk about this today for two reasons. First, as we all know, we are coming out of one of the most significant disruptions to life that I hope any of us will ever know. I don't need to recount the facts and figures for you because you know them so deeply. We've seen a pandemic firsthand. We're still unsure of where our feet will fall as we take our steps forward day after day. We are still figuring out how ultimately we will respond to this significant change in society and this disruption that has impacted all our lives. Secondly, though, I want to speak about our ability to adapt and respond because we are in communal transition. We feel it in large and small ways, from generational leadership to the use of our facility in new ways to essential questions about what it means to be tasked with the project of serving the Jewish community in 2022. We are in a moment that demands our careful attention. I think our tradition has something to teach us about how we will respond ultimately to what is ahead. To see this, though, we must first understand exactly what was destroyed in that observance we connect to Tisha B'Av. The temple that stood in Jerusalem was a very significant building. It was the center of civilization and society. For the Jews of that time period, the temple was where God entered the world, and its structures and uses set the tone for how this society organized itself. The Jews of this era really believed in the power of this place. In the center of that building that stood in Jerusalem, at the core of that great edifice, sat a room they called the Holy of Holies. During the time of the first temple, that room was where they kept the Ark of the Covenant, the most sacred objects of their tradition. By the time of the return from exile and the establishment of the second temple, that room now sat empty. The Holy of Holies was so sacred that no one went into that room all year long, except for once a year, when the high priest would enter to perform the sacred rituals of the holiday. But even when a human was willing to enter that space to perform those sacred rituals of Yom Kippur, he would only do it after a month of meditation and preparation. And even then, he would tie a rope around his waist and go in, lest tragedy befall him in the presence of the divine. No one else could enter to save him, and he could be pulled out to freedom. That's how important this building was to these people. That's how much these people believed in the temple. That's how important this place was to their construction of self and their ties of communal belonging. There was no Judaism without the temple. That is, at least, until things started to change. In 67 CE, the Jews began a revolt against the Romans. Religious tensions between Romans and Jews created conflict, and the crisis escalated due to protests and attacks between Jews and the Roman citizens. Vespasian invaded the Galilee under Emperor Nero to crush the great revolt of Judea. Despite best efforts of the rebel army, the ruling force was too strong to overcome. In their anger, and in an effort to exert power and authority, the Romans decided to destroy the temple. The building is decimated. The Holy of Holies is no more. The Jews have been defeated. At that moment in history, it would have made sense for the Jewish people to be done. The project is over. The central place of worship is gone. All could be seen as meaningless and void. How will these people respond? Yochanan ben Zakkai, a great leader and sage of the first century, flees to the hills and sets up a school with his students at Yavneh. The task before these scholars and sages is to think through their options as a result of these tragic events. Everyone was asking themselves the same question. What do we do now? Perhaps these people thought to themselves, does God hate us? What kind of God does this to his people? What sort of covenant results in exile and torture and destruction? As they considered this, it would have been reasonable for Yochanan ben Zakkai to answer, yeah, it is over. The game is done. Go home. Go become Romans. Give up on this, because what we knew is no more. And I'm sure many Jews did that. After all, this is the same period that gives us the birth of the nascent Christian community. One of the ways they could have responded would have been to pack it all up, cede authority to those in power. Romans win, Jews lose. However, to these questions, there would have been another option for Yochanan ben Zakkai and his students and friends. Perhaps these Jews could have thought to themselves, well, God destroyed Pharaoh. God will destroy the Romans. Let's hold on to our folk ways. Let's hold on to our practices, and let's let this play out for a little bit. All we need is another Moses and 10 plagues and some wondrous miracles, and then we'll be fine. Of course, they could have said that. Of course, they could have waited. But I think we all know the result wouldn't have been great. There were no miracles coming in their direction. So what does Yochanan ben Zakkai and the men of the Great Assembly say in response to the destruction they have just endured? Hu haya omer. I'm going to quote this in Hebrew because for some, the words said here are so ubiquitous you may never have stopped to even consider their meaning. Hu haya omer, al shlosha devarim ha'olam omed. Upon three things the whole world stands. Al ha-Torah, ve'al ha'avodah, ve'al gemilut chasadim. On Torah, on worship, and on acts of loving kindness. It's a remarkable response. The words are recorded right at the beginning of the Mishnah. These students and teachers have just seen their entire world collapse, and they respond by saying, the world stands, the world still exists, but now it exists on three things: Torah, avodah, and gemilut chasadim. Torah, worship, and acts of loving kindness. It's that same song you sang, perhaps, at summer camp. So what is their response to catastrophe? They say, we will learn Torah. We no longer have the Beit HaMikdash, the temple, but we do have the Beit HaMidrash, the study hall. Learning and scholarship become a central expression of Jewish identity and a fundamental piece of what it means to participate in the Jewish project. In our tradition, what it means to experience richness is to experience the ideas of the books on our shelves, the ideas hidden and uncovered and discovered through the generations of those who have written and studied and learned with us and that we can learn with. It's so ingrained, this idea that Torah and that learning all day is so ingrained in what it means to be Jewish that even Tevye wants to do it. Yes, all day long he'd biddy biddy bum. But don't forget the climax of the song, and I'm going to quote it now. If I were rich, I'd have the time that I lack to sit in the synagogue and pray, and maybe have a seat by the eastern wall, and I'd discuss the holy books with learned men 7 hours a day. And that would be the sweetest thing of all. So for these rabbis, for this community that needs to respond to the destruction of the temple, what do they say? The temple is no more, no problem. We've got Torah. We've got the pursuit of a life of study and exploration and connection. For the Jewish people, learning is the beginning of a response to catastrophe. And this idea really takes hold. The centrality of Torah becomes so pervasive that it guides all that we do moving forward. It supplants Jerusalem. It takes the place of the temple and becomes the focus around which we build out all the rest of our experiences. Some of you will say, but Rabbi, you're overlooking the real connections Jews have with Jerusalem. That's the direction we face when we pray. Of course, I would agree. That is the direction we face. Not only that, if we're in Jerusalem, what direction do we face? Of course, we face the Temple Mount, the place where the temple once stood. And if we're at the Temple Mount, what direction do we face? We face toward the Holy of Holies, except in one instance. What do we do? What direction do we face if there's a Torah in the room? Even if we're in Jerusalem, even if we're in Jerusalem and the temple is in that direction and Torah is in this direction, what way do we face? We face towards the Torah. Why? Because Torah has become more important. It has become the center of Jewish expression. That building was important, but it has been supplanted by the stories and laws contained within our Holy Scroll. But the answer that our sages give us is not just Torah. The sages also say avodah, worship. Sacrifice is no more goats and grains, but avodah, worship, becomes the work of the heart. By the hands of the rabbis, the altar is transformed, and now you sit at an altar. We sit at an altar, but we call it the Shabbat table. Think about the symbolism we enact at our Shabbat dinners. We adorn our tables with a special bread we call challah, a word taken from the rituals connected with baking bread for the priests in the temple. But the priests are no longer present. We are the priests, and our Shabbat dinner is a symbolic sacrifice we conduct while sitting around our dining room tables. We ritually wash our hands before eating our Sabbath meal because we are pretending to be the priests who need to purify our hands before doing the holy work of sacrifice. We pour salt on our bread because every sacrifice was offered with salt. Our homes are now the locus of Jewish experience. No temple, no problem. We've got Shabbat dinner. And by the way, Shabbat dinner is one pretty fantastic practice. I think it's one of the best things we've got. God was liberated from the temple. Now God can be anywhere, including in Tulsa. This is the same message we heard yesterday from Rabbi Fitzerman and his senior sermon. God can be anywhere. Anywhere we gather to celebrate, to be together, is now a place of holiness and consecration. Synagogues become an essential expression of Jewish life. Sure, the Kotel, the Western Wall, in Jerusalem is important, but it is not the totality of Jewish experience. If the Kotel was the totality of Jewish experience, then why do we have synagogues in Jerusalem? Because God no longer has a place. God is anywhere. God is not more present at the Kotel than in Tulsa. In fact, I think we can make the opposite case. It's more miraculous and surprising that we have a vibrant Jewish existence in Tulsa, Oklahoma, than it would be to say there's a vibrant Jewish existence in Jerusalem. When the rabbis faced their most profound upheaval in history, they turned it into a moment to reinvent Jewish institutions. They reconceived their deepest values of Jewish life and completely reinvented what it means to be Jewish. That's the genius of the Jewish people. Repeatedly, we have shown a remarkable capacity for resilience. We have turned disasters into moments to reimagine our mission and our purpose in this world. Calamities are not the end of a moment, but rather the beginning. The task in these moments is reinvention and creativity. Lest you think that the only moment of reinvention comes from the destruction of the temple, let me remind you that virtually all the great books and ideas of our tradition come out of a response to changing circumstances and the need to reinvent ourselves. Out of the exile to Babylon in 586 comes the text of the Torah. Out of the confrontation with Hellenism comes the canonization of the Tanakh. Out of the destruction of the temple in 70 comes the Talmudic tradition, the Mishnah, and the Gemara. Out of the confrontation with philosophy comes Saadia Gaon and Maimonides. Out of the conquest of Spain comes the Zohar and the mystical tradition. Out of the pogroms of Eastern Europe comes the Baal Shem Tov and Hasidism. Out of the tragedies of modernity comes the Zionist idea. Each of these moments are moments of discontinuity and disruption, where instead of simply replaying what had always been done in community, our ancestors have found new expressions of identity and purpose and place. We too are in a moment of upheaval, a moment of discontinuity, a moment where we need to and are reinventing ourselves. But it's not just COVID. For a long time, American Jewish life, American religious life, has been in a moment of religious reinvention and shifting. A need for us to change our ways, a need for us to rethink about who we are and what our purpose is. The only thing COVID has done is highlight the broader moment we now find ourselves in. We've begun to do this work as a synagogue for many, many years now. Uniquely, it's the work Rabbi Fitzerman began a decade, 2 decades ago, what was described yesterday. At B'nai Emunah, for years, we've thought of ourselves in an expanded capacity, breaking the boundaries of what typically define houses of worship. And now we find ourselves further into a moment to reimagine and claim what we will be in the generation ahead. What's to come? It's hard to know. Yesterday, Rabbi Fitzerman said, in 30 years, all synagogues will look like B'nai Emunah. I think he's right. We must continue to push ourselves beyond convention and experiment with new forms of identity and affiliation. We need to express our self-confidence as an innovative Jewish community and entrain more and more in the ways of thinking that share our values, our worldview, and our vision for expanded Jewish life. We must be in conversation about the diversity of Jewish expression and continually see ourselves as part of the fabric of Tulsa and the broader Jewish world. Some of this I know we are already doing. I get calls and emails weekly from rabbis and synagogue boards interested in learning how we became a refugee resettlement agency. I have a feeling that the cameras and screens now enabling this experience will continue to allow us to pray, mourn, and learn together. We are now connected in ways we have never been before. We are a people with a long history of cultural resilience and spiritual creativity. We have always found it within ourselves the capacity to reinvent. Do I know exactly how we will do it? I have a sense of where we are headed. But importantly, I know we will figure it out together. To return to my first moments in an Oklahoma synagogue those years ago, long before this was a reality, what I felt then is something I continue to feel now. There is something special and unique about being Jewish, even if you are one of the very few people to show up for Tisha B'Av services. Because what matters about the lessons from that day we observe on Tisha B'Av is not the 9th of Av. What matters about that holiday is the 10th of Av, that community continued to exist and continues to exist, and that when a rabbinical student was making his way off across country, of course there was a community in Oklahoma City, and of course they were holding services for that holiday. Because Jewish life existed and continued to exist after the destruction of the Second Temple, and Jewish life continues to exist today. Jewish life existed before calamity and destruction, and because of the work of our ancestors, because of the work of those who have come before us, we have an ability to reinvent and see ourselves anew. That is the task ahead of us. On this new year and in this moment of response and renewal, let us be strengthened by the knowledge of our capacity for resilience. May we be inspired by our ancestors to show us what it means to come through catastrophe, and may we find within ourselves what it takes to be the ones who answer this moment and preserve the essence of what it means to be part of the Jewish people. On this Rosh Hashanah, so may we be blessed. Let us say together, Amen, Amen.